The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on Alara's chest, stealing the air she needed to breathe. It seeped through the single, thin blanket draped over the small bodies, through the threadbare shawl wrapped around her own shoulders. The shanty groaned under the relentless wind that clawed at the gaps in the walls, a mournful, ceaseless sound that echoed the emptiness in her belly and the vast, echoing fear in her soul. Outside, the world was a blur of gray, frozen earth stretching towards a horizon that offered no comfort, no promise of reprieve. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the faint, sharp scent of starvation. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, not properly in a week. There was nothing left. The scraps she'd managed to scavenge from the edges of the settlement had vanished days ago. The fire pit was cold, holding only gray ash that mocked her with its uselessness. Her fingers, numb and stiff, traced the outline of the small faces nestled close to her. They were too still, too quiet. Their skin held the pale, translucent quality that spoke of profound hunger. Tears, long since frozen on her cheeks, had left trails like snail tracks on her skin. There were no more tears to shed, only a dry, hollow ache that consumed her. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, abandoned here, in this desolate shack on the edge of the world, with the 2 tiny lives entrusted to her care. Her mind replayed the last moments, the hurried words, the disappearing figure, the chilling finality of the silence that followed. Despair was a suffocating shroud. She felt herself slipping, the edges of her consciousness blurring, the cold lulling her towards a dark, quiet sleep. But then a tiny whimper, barely audible, pierced the fog. One of the babies stirred, a weak, listless movement. A raw, primal instinct flared, burning briefly against the encroaching numbness. She had to find a way. But how? With what? She had nothing. Absolutely nothing. A sound cut through the wind's howl, a crunching of boots on frozen earth, closer than any sound had been in days. Fear, sharp and immediate, jolted her fully awake. She froze, pulling the blanket tighter, her eyes fixed on the gap where the door hung crookedly on a single hinge. Was it someone from the settlement? Had they finally come? To help? Or to cast judgment, to blame? The shadows in the corners of the shanty seemed to deepen, concealing her, offering a fragile, useless shield. The crunching stopped just outside. A moment of agonizing silence stretched, taut and brittle as ice. Then, the door creaked inward with a reluctant groan. A figure filled the opening, silhouetted against the bleak sky. Tall, broad-shouldered, bundled against the cold. He paused, his gaze sweeping the interior. Even in the dim light, she could feel the weight of his scrutiny. He said nothing, simply stood there, a stark, imposing presence in the doorway. Alara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She watched him, a stranger, enter her world of frozen despair, and waited, bracing herself for whatever fate he might bring. He stepped inside, letting the door swing back to hang precariously. The cold intensified, rushing in with him. He carried a sack slung over one shoulder. His face was obscured by the brim of a low-slung hat, but his eyes, when they finally settled on her huddled form in the corner, seemed unervingly steady, devoid of immediate judgment, but also of warmth. They simply observed. He didn't speak. Instead, he lowered the sack to the floor with a soft thud. The sound seemed deafening in the stillness. He then began to move around the small space, his movements deliberate, efficient. He ignored her completely, focusing on the cold hearth. He knelt, pulling kindling and small pieces of wood from the sack. Soon, a spark flickered, tentative at first, then catching, growing into a small, dancing flame. The warmth was instantaneous, a fragile miracle pushing back the oppressive cold. Alara watched him, her fear slowly giving way to a bewildered confusion. He wasn't yelling, wasn't accusing, wasn't turning her out. He was building a fire. As the flames grew, casting flickering light across the room, she saw his face more clearly. Rugged, weathered, etched with lines that spoke of a hard life. His expression remained stoic, unreadable. He wasn't young, but carried himself with a quiet strength. Once the fire was established, he stood and turned, his gaze meeting hers again. This time, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not anger, but perhaps a weary understanding. He reached into his sack again, producing a small, wrapped bundle. He knelt beside the fire, unwrapping it to reveal a piece of dried meat and a hard biscuit. He held it out towards her. Alara hesitated. Hunger gnawed at her, a relentless, burning agony. But the ingrained caution, the fear of strangers, held her back. His hand remained steady, waiting. After a long moment, compelled by the desperate need and the silent plea of the tiny figures beside her, she reached out a trembling hand and took the food. Her fingers brushed his, and his skin felt rough, calloused. He withdrew his hand slowly. She tore off a small piece of the meat with her teeth, chewing slowly, the taste of salt and sustenance almost overwhelming. He watched her eat, still saying nothing. Then he turned his attention to the babies. He approached cautiously, kneeling a short distance away, observing them. Alara tensed, ready to shield them if needed, though her strength felt like water. He didn't touch them. Instead, he reached into his sack one last time and pulled out a folded length of rough but clean cloth. He laid it near the fire, letting the warmth seep into it. He also took out a small, battered tin cup and a flask. He poured a little water from the flask into the cup and held it over the fire, warming it gently. Alara watched, a knot forming in her throat. These were not the actions of someone bringing harm. These were the actions of someone helping. The silent, steady competence of his movements chipped away at her fear, replacing it with a fragile, tentative hope. He was a stranger, yes, but in this desolate place, his quiet presence felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in a very long time. Days bled into nights, marked only by the rising and setting of the gray sun. The stranger, Elias, stayed. He never spoke of why, never asked about the past she carried like a stone in her gut. His presence was a quiet rhythm in the small shanty. Each morning, he would leave before dawn, returning in the late afternoon with whatever he had managed to find: small game snared, frozen roots dug from the iron-hard ground, sometimes even a few pieces of firewood dragged from a surprising distance. He moved with the land, seemingly invisible to the few scattered homesteads further off. He was a man of few words, his voice a low rumble when he did speak, usually to state a simple fact or give a necessary instruction. Fire needs wood, or water's warming, or eat. Alara, weak but slowly regaining her strength, began to navigate this strange new existence. Her initial fear of him had softened, replaced by a profound, unspoken gratitude. She watched him, learning his quiet efficiency, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the steady calm that seemed to emanate from him even in the face of the unrelenting hardship. She started to help, her movements slow and hesitant at first, then gaining a quiet purpose. She tended the fire, keeping the fragile warmth alive. She unfolded the cloth Elias had warmed, wrapping the babies, whispering to them, trying to coax life back into their small bodies. Elias would watch her sometimes, his gaze lingering, but he never offered platitudes, never spoke of hope or despair. He simply provided the means to survive, and expected her to use them. The babies began to stir more often, their cries weak at first, then gaining a little more volume. Elias, with surprising gentleness, showed Alara how to make a thin broth from the scraps of meat and roots he brought back, feeding it to the infants drop by precious drop. It was agonizingly slow progress, but progress nonetheless. A fragile bond formed between Alara and Elias, built not on shared stories or emotional declarations, but on the silent, shared fight for survival. They were two solitary figures against a vast, indifferent world, bound together by the vulnerability of the two tiny lives they sheltered. One evening, as the wind howled around the shanty, a new sound reached them, the distant jingle of harness, the creak of wheels. Elias froze, his head snapping up. He moved swiftly, extinguishing the fire, plunging the shanty into sudden darkness save for the faint light filtering through the gaps. He pushed Alara and the babies into the deepest shadow, his body shielding them. "Stay quiet," he murmured, his voice a low rasp, the most urgent words she had heard him speak. Fear, cold and sharp, returned. Was it the people from the settlement? Had they found her? Or someone else? The sounds grew closer, stopping not far from the shanty. Muffled voices drifted on the wind, too indistinct to understand, but filled with a rough, careless energy that sent a shiver down Alara's spine. They were close, too close. The voices grew louder, clearer now, laced with coarse laughter. The shanty door groaned as a boot kicked it harder than before, and it swung fully open with a loud crack. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the night, their faces hidden in shadow, but their bulk imposing. One held a lantern, its flickering light casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. The cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of stale alcohol and unwashed bodies. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Elias stood perfectly still, a statue of grim defiance in the darkness. They had found them. The fragile haven was breached. The figures stepped inside, their eyes scanning the dim interior. The lantern light fell upon Alara and the babies huddled in the corner, then shifted to Elias standing between them and the intruders. A rough voice slurred, "Well now, what's this?" "Thought this place was empty. Looks like someone's squatting," another figure snickered. "And looky here, a woman and babes. Pretty little thing to be hidin' out in the cold." Alara felt a surge of primal fear, a desperate need to protect the infants. She gripped the blanket tighter, her eyes fixed on the men, then flicked to Elias. His posture was tense, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't speak, but his silence was a tangible force, a challenge. "You," the first voice addressed Elias. "What's your business here? This land ain't yours." Elias's voice, when he finally spoke, was low, measured, and utterly devoid of fear. "Just passing through." Taking shelter, the men exchanged glances. "Passing through? Looks more like settlin' in. And with company. Where'd you get 'em?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken menace. Alara's breath hitched. This was it. The judgment. The potential danger not just to her, but to Elias for sheltering her. Elias didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a step forward, his frame blocking more of the lantern light. "There's nothing here for you. Move along." The men laughed, harsh and unpleasant sounds. "Nothing? We'll see about that. Maybe there's something we can take." Or someone, one of the men started to advance, his eyes fixed on Alara. But Elias moved like lightning, a blur in the dim light. His hand shot out, seizing the wrist of the man with the lantern, twisting it sharply. The man cried out in pain, dropping the lantern, which clattered on the floor, the flame sputtering and dying, plunging the shanty back into near-total darkness. Chaos erupted, a grunt of pain, the thud of a body hitting the floor, the sound of a struggle. Alara pulled the babies closer, pressing herself against the cold wall, her heart pounding like a drum. She couldn't see what was happening, only hear the sounds of the fight, grunts, curses, the scrape of boots. Elias fought with a brutal efficiency, honed by necessity. It wasn't a prolonged brawl, but a swift, decisive confrontation. Within moments, the sounds of struggle subsided, replaced by pained moans and ragged breathing. Elias's voice, calm but sharp, cut through the darkness. "Get out, and don't come back." Silence. Then, the sound of stumbling feet, the groan of the door as the remaining figures dragged their injured comrade outside. The jingle of harness, the creak of wheels, receding into the distance until only the wind remained. Elias stood breathing heavily in the darkness. Alara stayed frozen, trembling, clutching the babies. He didn't move towards her immediately. He waited, listening to the retreating sounds, ensuring they were gone. Then, slowly, he moved towards the hearth, stirring the embers, coaxing the fire back to life. As the flames grew, casting their warm, familiar glow, Alara saw him clearly. There was a cut above his eye, and his knuckles were bruised, but his expression was as stoic as ever. He knelt by the fire, and Alara, watching him, felt the last vestiges of her fear and helplessness drain away. She had been vulnerable, yes, desperate and weak, but in the face of danger, she had felt a fierce, protective strength surge through her. She had shielded the babies, ready to fight with bare hands if necessary. And Elias, he hadn't abandoned them. He had stood between them and harm, a silent, formidable guardian. He had found her at her lowest point, offered sustenance and shelter, and now protection. But more than that, his quiet endurance, his practical competence, had shown her that survival was not just about luck, but about doing what needed to be done day after day. She looked at the sleeping faces of the twins, then across the fire at Elias, who was carefully binding his hand. They were still in the shanty, still on the edge of a harsh world, but something had shifted. She was no longer waiting to be rescued or judged. She was a part of this fragile, fierce partnership. Resilience wasn't a gift bestowed. It was a fire forged in the coldest, darkest places. And she had found her spark. The road ahead was uncertain, the hardships immense, but she would face them. Not alone, but with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed, beside the silent man who had shown her the way back from the brink. The shanty was no longer a tomb, but a hearth, and within its walls, a fragile, determined hope had taken root.